She was on her knees in my break room, with a bucket of gray water, going over the baseboards with a rag, and I heard Walter, though I didn't know his name yet, say to one of my machinists, plain as anything, "I built this company." And I laughed. Not a big laugh, a short one, out my nose. The kind you give when somebody says something so far off the mark it doesn't even earn a real reaction. I looked at his coveralls, at the mop bucket, at his hands, and I thought, sure you did, old man. I want to tell you right now, before anything else, that I was wrong. Dead wrong. And it took me the better part of a year to find out how wrong. And by the time I did, the damage was already sitting where I couldn't take it back. My name's Deborah Holleran. Everybody calls me Deb. I'm 53 years old. I run a tool and die shop in Erie, Pennsylvania, called Halloran Tool and Die. 41 employees on the floor as of last count, and I've run it for 11 years, since my father had his first stroke and handed me the keys because there wasn't anybody else in line for them. I've got a husband, Gary, who drives a truck for a regional freight outfit, and a son, Colin, who's 26 and works my shop floor same as I did at his age, learning the presses from the bottom same as everybody has to. I'm going to tell this the way it happened, start to finish, in order. Because if I skip around, you'll end up thinking better of me earlier than I earned it, and I don't want that. I should tell you first who I was before any of this, because you won't understand the laugh if you don't understand where it came from. My father, Frank Halloran, started this shop in 1968 in a cinder block building on the east side of town that we still use for overflow storage. I grew up hearing the story of that shop the way some kids hear Bible stories. Repeated so many times it stopped being history and became something closer to scripture. Frank Halloran, 26 years old, $600 borrowed against his own car, a second-hand stamping press he bought off a company going under, and grit. That was the whole story, every time. Grit and a stamping press and a man who wouldn't quit. I believed it the way you believe the sky is blue. I built my whole sense of myself on it. The idea that this shop, and by extension me, came from nothing but one man's hands and one man's stubbornness, and that everything we had, we'd earned clean. No favors, no help, no debt to anybody. That matters, because it's the root of what I did. I want to be plain about this and not dress it up. I grew up in a shop culture, in a town, in a family, where the assumption ran deep and mostly unspoken that the men who built things, real things, the ones with their names on the building, looked a certain way, and the men who cleaned up after them looked a different way, and you could generally tell which was which before either of them opened their mouth. Nobody sat me down and taught me that outright. Nobody had to. It was just the water everybody swam in on that side of town in those years, and I swam in it, same as anyone. And I never once, not till the year I'm telling you about, stopped to ask myself whether the water was clean. I'd seen black men on our floor my whole life, good machinists. A couple of my best foremen over the years were black men. I want that on the record too. Because this isn't a story about me thinking black men couldn't be skilled. It's narrower and uglier than that, and I'd rather you know the narrow, ugly version than let me hide behind a wider one that makes it sound like simple ignorance. What I assumed, specifically, standing in that break room, was this: an old black man in a facilities company uniform pushing a mop bucket around my shop on a third-party cleaning contract. Making $11 an hour if he was making a dime over minimum. That man does not own anything. That man does not build anything. That man is exactly what he appears to be, and if he says otherwise, he's either confused or he's lying, and either way it's not worth my time to find out which. That was the whole of it. That was the thought, complete, in maybe a second and a half before the laugh came out. I didn't examine it. I didn't need to. It felt like common sense, the same way the sky being blue felt like common sense, and that's exactly the kind of thought that gets away with the most damage, because nobody ever bothers to check it. My father was 79 that year, 4 years past the stroke that put me in this chair, living at home with my mother, failing in the slow way strokes let a man fail. Good days, bad days. A memory that came and went depending on the hour. I'll come back to him. He matters more to this story than I understood at the time. Colin was 24 that year, still green on the floor, running the same stamping press his grandfather bought secondhand in 1968, which we'd kept running through 3 rebuilds because Frank Halloran never threw anything away that still had work left in it. Colin's the one who told me, months later, that he remembered the old man from the cleaning crew nodding at that press once. A long look, like he recognized it. I hadn't thought anything of it at the time. I think about it plenty now. The cleaning contract itself was nothing. We used a facilities outfit out of the county. 6 or 8 guys who rotated through the industrial parks on the east side twice a week, emptying trash, mopping the break rooms, wiping down the offices. I didn't know their names. I didn't know Walter Briggs's name until it was too late to have learned it the easy way, which is to say, by simply asking. That's who I was, walking into the moment I'm about to tell you. A woman who believed her father built something from nothing, who'd swallowed that story whole without ever once checking its seams, and who had just enough unexamined certainty about who builds things and who cleans up after them to laugh in an old man's face without giving it a second thought. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March, and I remember it was cold enough that the guys on the floor still had the space heaters running by the loading dock, because that's the kind of detail you hold on to once you understand what a day cost you. I'd come into the break room to grab coffee before a meeting with a vendor, and there were 3 of my machinists in there on their lunch. Dale Petruski, who'd been with me 11 years, a kid named Jorge Reyes, who was maybe 2 years into the trade, and Colin, my son, off in the corner reading something on his phone and not really part of the conversation yet. Walter was on his knees by the baseboard heater along the far wall, working a rag along a run of grime that had built up there for longer than the cleaning contract had probably existed, taking his time with it in a way that told me, if I'd been paying attention, that this was a man who did a thing properly or didn't do it at all. He had on the gray coverall the cleaning company issued, Briggs Facilities Maintenance stitched crooked over the pocket, work boots gone soft and gray at the toe from years of use. Dale was talking, the way Dale always talked, filling silence whether anybody wanted it filled or not, going on about a stamping die that had given him trouble that morning, how it was misaligned coming off the last rebuild and he'd had to shim it twice before it ran true. And Walter, still on his knees, still working the rag, said, without looking up, sounds like the guide pins walked on you. Happens on the older bliss presses when the bushings wear unevenly. You check the bushing clearance before you shimmed it, or after. Dale kind of laughed, more surprised than mocking, and said something like, since when do you know bliss presses? And Walter said, plain, not defensive, not puffed up about it either, just stating a fact the way you'd state your own name, since about 1974. I ran this floor for 22 years before Frank Halloran sold the maintenance contract out to save on payroll. I'd built this company, son, just not with these hands anymore. That's when I laughed. I want to describe exactly what I did, because I think the doing of it matters more than the sound of it. I was standing in the doorway with my coffee mug in my hand, and I let out that short laugh through my nose, and I said, I remember the words almost exact. They've replayed enough times in my head that I could recite them like a psalm. I said, that's a hell of a story for a man with a mop. And then I looked at Dale and Jorge like I was inviting them into the joke, like this was just a funny thing that had happened, an old man playing dress up in my father's history, and I said, "Finish up in here. We've got to walk through it too." And I turned to leave, coffee in hand, like the conversation was already over. Because as far as I was concerned, it was. Walter didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand up fast, or throw the rag down, or do any of the things a man's allowed to do when somebody laughs in his face over something true. He just sat back on his heels for a second, looked at me. Not glaring, not pleading, just looking. The kind of look that takes your measure and doesn't need to say anything else, because the look itself is the whole sentence. And then he went back to the baseboard, and he said, "Quiet. Mostly to the wall. All right." That was it. All right. 2 words, and he kept working the rag. Slow, thorough, like nothing had happened, like I hadn't just told him his own life wasn't real in front of 3 men who worked for me. Jorge shifted in his seat. He was young, new enough to the shop that he hadn't yet learned which battles were worth his job, and I could see him deciding, in real time, whether to say something. He didn't. Dale, though. Dale had 11 years in with me, and 11 years buys a man a certain amount of room to talk back, and he used it. "Deb," he said. And there was an edge in it I didn't love hearing. "That's Walter Briggs. My Uncle Ron worked under him in the 80s. Man ran 3 shifts on this floor back when your dad still had the whole building. You might want to. I've got to walk through it too," I said again. And I said it in the tone I used when a conversation was over, whether the other person agreed it was over or not. And I walked out with my coffee. And I did not look back at Walter. And I did not think about it again for the rest of that day, or the day after, or most of that year. I want you to sit with how easy that was for me. That's the part that still gets me, looking back. Not that I said it. People say worse things than that every day without meaning to do any harm at all. But how little it cost me to say it and walk away. I didn't lie awake over it. I didn't mention it to Gary at dinner. It didn't register as an event in my life at all. It registered, if it registered as anything, as a small, forgettable moment of a strange old man saying something odd, and me having the good sense to not entertain it. That's the truth of how casually a person can do real harm to another person and feel, walking away, nothing at all. Walter finished the baseboards that day, and he came back twice a week, same as always for the next several months, same route, same rag, same quiet economy of motion. And if he thought about that Tuesday every time he walked back into that break room, he never once let it show on his face where I could see it. I didn't ask him his name in all that time. I want that on the record plainly. I worked in the same building as that man twice a week for the better part of a year after I laughed at him, and I never once bothered to learn his name. It took somebody else telling it to me, months later, under circumstances I never would have chosen. Before I finally knew who I'd been laughing at, the crack in my own life came the way most cracks come. Not on a schedule, not with any sense of poetry to it, just ordinary bad luck showing up on an ordinary Thursday and refusing to leave. My father had his second stroke that August, worse than the first, and this one took something from him that the first one hadn't. His speech went sideways for a few weeks, and even after it came back, it was never quite as sure-footed as it had been, words arriving a half-second late, like they had to travel further to reach his mouth than they used to. He was in the hospital 11 days. I split my time between the shop and his room the way you do, running on no sleep, signing off on purchase orders in a hospital cafeteria, and somewhere in that stretch. My own business decided it wasn't going to make things easy on me either. We'd taken on a job that spring for an automotive supplier out of Youngstown, a run of stamped brackets, decent-sized contract, the kind of work that keeps 41 people employed through a slow quarter. The press we ran it on was the old Bliss, The one Dale had shimmed back in March. The one my father bought secondhand in 1968 and that Colin now ran most days. It started throwing out of tolerance parts in early September, right in the middle of my father's hospital stay, right when I had the least bandwidth in the world to deal with it, and Dale's shimming fix from the spring turned out to have been a Band-Aid on something bigger. The guide bushings weren't just worn, they were shot clean through, and the press needed a full tear down and rebuild if we were going to hold tolerance on that Youngstown contract, and if we didn't hold tolerance, we lost the contract, and losing that contract in the state my books were in that year meant layoffs, and I don't say that lightly. I'd never laid anybody off in 11 years of running that shop. I wasn't going to start because I let a machine run itself into the ground while my head was somewhere else. I called 3 rebuild shops. 2 of them didn't have anybody who worked that model Bliss anymore. It was old enough by then that most of the young techs coming up had never touched one. Everything they trained on was newer, servo-driven, computer-calibrated. The 3rd shop quoted me 11 weeks out just to get a tech on site, which might as well have been never, given how fast I was bleeding contract deadline. It was Colin who said it. He came into the office one night while I was on the phone getting my 4th no in a row, and he waited till I hung up, and he said, "Ma, the guy who cleans the break room, Walter, he said something back in the spring about knowing these presses. Might be worth asking." I remember exactly what I felt in that moment, and I'm not going to pretend it was some noble instinct kicking in. What I felt, first, was annoyance at Colin for bringing up a strange old man's boast from 6 months back like it was a real lead, and at myself, underneath that, for the fact that some small, stubborn part of me had actually filed that comment away back in March, even while I was laughing it off in the moment, because part of me had heard the specifics in what he said: guide pins, bushing clearance, the model number, and some quiet corner of my brain had noted, even then, that those weren't the specifics of a man making something up. I didn't want to call him. I want to be honest about that too. Pride's an ugly thing to examine in yourself, and mine was plenty ugly that week. Some part of me understood, dimly, that calling Walter Briggs meant going back on what I'd said in March, meant standing in front of a man I'd humiliated and asking him for help. And every instinct I had told me that was a door I didn't want to walk through. But I had 11 weeks of nothing from the rebuild shops, and a contract that would gut my payroll if I lost it, and pride doesn't pay 41 people's mortgages. So I asked Colin to get me a number. I called Briggs Facilities Maintenance, and I asked to speak to Walter directly, which the woman who answered found a little odd. He wasn't the kind of employee people called the office asking for by name, and she said she'd have him call me back, and 2 days later he did. I remember the call more clearly than I remember most conversations from that whole year, because I remember how careful I had to be with my own voice, keeping it businesslike, keeping it flat, so that none of what I was actually feeling, which was something between embarrassment and a low, grinding dread, would leak through into how I sounded. "Mr. Briggs," I said. And I remember that I used Mr. deliberately, like the word itself might undo something. "This is Deborah Halloran. Halloran Tool and Die. I understand you used to work on our floor." There was a pause on the line, not long, but long enough that I felt it. "I did," he said. 22 years. "I've got a Bliss press down," I said. 1968 model, guide bushings shot. "I've called around, nobody local touches these anymore. My son mentioned you might know your way around one." Another pause. And then, even, unbothered, he said, "I know that press personally. I set the tooling on it the week your daddy bought it. A beat. You're asking me to come fix it." "I am," I said, and it cost me more to say those 4 words than almost anything I'd said in years running that shop. "All right," he said. Same 2 words he'd said in the break room in March. I'll come Thursday. He came Thursday. In his own truck, with his own toolbox, not the coveralls this time, work clothes, but his own, not Briggs Facilities' gray uniform, and I noticed that and didn't think much of it in the moment, though I understand now that it was its own kind of statement, a man showing up on his own terms to do work he wasn't obligated to do. On a floor where a woman had laughed at his history 6 months before. He walked that press like he'd known it his whole life, because he had. He ran his hand along the frame before he even opened a panel, the way you'd put a hand on a horse you hadn't seen in years before you did anything else with it. He found the bushing wear inside 20 minutes, worse than any of the rebuild shops had guessed from my description over the phone, and he laid out, plain and specific, what it would take to bring it back true. Parts, hours, sequence. The way a man talks when he's done a thing 1,000 times and doesn't need to perform his competence for anybody watching. Colin stood next to him most of that first day, quiet, watching, and I noticed Colin's questions get more careful, more respectful, as the day went on, the way a young man's questions do when he's realized he's standing next to somebody who actually knows. It was on the second day that I started hearing things I hadn't asked to hear, and didn't know yet how much they'd cost me. Dale was the one who started it, on a smoke breakout by the loading dock, not realizing I was close enough by the propped door to catch most of it. He was talking to Jorge, low, the way men talk when they think a story's just for each other. "You know who that is, right?" Dale said. "That's Walter Briggs. Man ran this whole floor, 3 shifts, back when your grandpa's era of guys were still working here. Jorge, before your time, before mine even, tail end of it. 22 years. My Uncle Ron used to say Briggs could diagnose a press by the sound it made walking past it, didn't even need to open the panel. A pause, and I could hear, even without seeing his face, that Dale's voice had gone lower, more careful. Man used to own a piece of this place too, way back, not officially on paper maybe, but everybody on that floor back then knew Frank Halloran didn't get this shop running on his own in '68. Story goes Briggs put in money he didn't have to spare, co-signed something, back when the bank wouldn't touch Frank without more collateral than he had. Whole reason the shop made it past the first 2 years. I stood there with my hand on that propped door and I did not go through it. I stood there and I listened to the rest, because some part of me needed to hear it from somebody who wasn't going to soften it for my benefit. "So why's he pushing a mop bucket now?" Jorge said. And I remember being grateful in a strange way that he asked the question, because it meant I didn't have to. Company changed hands somewhere in the 90s, way I heard it, Dale said. Frank sold off the maintenance side of the operation to cut payroll during a rough stretch, brought in the outside contractor. Briggs's position got folded into that, and near as I ever heard, there wasn't much of a fight put up for him to stay on running the floor the way he had been. Man's near 70 now, kept working the cleaning contract because it kept him close to a place he built, I guess, and because a pension from a stamping shop in this town in the 90s wasn't ever going to be much to retire on anyway. He's got a daughter runs a school over in Mill Creek, I hear. Grandkids, whole life outside these walls, same as anybody. Man's not some sad story, Jorge, don't get that idea. He's just a man who got shortchanged by people who should have known better. I let go of the door and walked back into my office and sat down at my desk and didn't do any work for about 20 minutes. I want to be honest about what I felt sitting there, because I think it's easy, telling a story like this after the fact, to make the feeling sound more dramatic and more immediate than it actually was. What I felt, mostly, was a kind of cold settling in my stomach. The specific cold of understanding you've done something you can't take back, mixed in with something uglier, which was a reflexive urge to argue with what I'd just heard. To tell myself Dale was exaggerating, that shop floor legends grow bigger with every retelling, that surely if any of that were really true, my father would have mentioned it to me at some point in 50-some years of me hearing that origin story on repeat. That instinct, the arguing with it instinct, is the part I'm least proud of, looking back, because it tells you something about how deep the assumption actually ran. Even faced with a specific account from a man who'd worked that floor 11 years, my first move was to look for the door marked "This isn't really that bad," instead of just sitting still and letting the fact be exactly as bad as it was. I didn't get the chance to keep arguing with it for long, though, because 2 days later my father, in one of his better stretches of speech that fall, gave me the rest of it himself, without my even asking. I'd brought him lunch, the way I did most Sundays, and I mentioned, careless, testing the water without meaning to test it, that we'd had Walter Briggs in fixing the old Bliss press. I watched something move across my father's face at the name, recognition, and something under the recognition that looked, unmistakably, like shame. An expression I had almost never seen on that man's face in 53 years of being his daughter. "Walter," he said, slow, the words still arriving late in that post-stroke way. "Walter Briggs." He was quiet a long moment, working something over, and then he said, $600 against my car wasn't enough. Debbie, bank wouldn't touch me. I was short near 2,000 more, and no collateral left to offer. Walter put up his own savings, co-signed what the bank would let him co-sign on account he already had a relationship with them from his own family's business dealings. Never took a piece of the company for it on paper, I offered, more than once, and he always said cash now mattered more to him than paper later. Man had a young family to feed. Ran the floor for me for 22 years like it was his own, because in every way that mattered, it was partly his. My father stopped, and his jaw worked for a second before the rest came out. When the maintenance contract went in the 90s, I let him get folded into it instead of fighting the board to keep him on staff proper. Told myself it wasn't my decision alone to make. That was a lie I told myself so I wouldn't have to feel what I'm feeling right now, telling you this. He looked at me, and his eyes were wet, which I had also almost never seen. I owe that man more than I ever paid him, Debbie. I've owed him 30 years and never once found the nerve to say it to his face. I sat in that room with my father, listening to a 53-year-old story crack open into something truer and uglier than the version I'd grown up on, and I didn't say much of anything. I remember reaching over and putting my hand on his, which isn't a thing we did much in my family, and he let me, and neither of us said anything else about it for the rest of the visit. I drove home that night and didn't turn the radio on, which if you know me is its own kind of tell, because I always have the radio on. Some talk station or another, noise to keep my head from doing exactly what it did that whole drive, which was replay March, over and over, the coffee mug in my hand, the sound of my own laugh coming out my nose, the 2 words Walter said back. All right. And hearing them now, for the first time, as what they actually were. Not agreement, not acceptance, just a man deciding, in real time, not to spend anything more on me than he had to. I want to name the thing plainly, the way I've tried to name everything else plainly in this telling, because I think it does nobody any good if I let myself off with something soft. What I assumed, standing in that break room, was that an old black man in a cleaning uniform, on his knees with a rag, could not possibly be a man who'd built anything, could not possibly hold the kind of history he was describing, and that whatever he said to the contrary was either delusion or a lie not worth the 2 seconds it'd take to check. I didn't think that because of anything Walter Briggs had ever done. I thought it because of what he looked like doing the job he was doing, at the age he was doing it, in a uniform that told me, before he'd said a single word, everything I thought I needed to know about what kind of man was allowed to have built something, and what kind of man was only ever allowed to clean up after somebody else's building. That's the whole of it. That's what I have to carry, not confusion, not an honest mistake made without information. A judgment I made instantly, with total confidence, based on nothing but what a man looked like on his knees in a break room, and I need to say clearly, so nobody mistakes what I'm about to say next for the actual lesson. I was wrong that day, regardless of what I later found out about him. I'd have been just as wrong if it turned out he really was nobody but a man with a mop bucket and a story he liked to tell. The wrongness wasn't in underestimating somebody important. The wrongness was in deciding, before he'd finished a sentence, that the dignity of what he was telling me didn't deserve 2 seconds of my attention. And that's true whether the man kneeling there had built 3 companies or none at all. I want that understood plain, because it would be easy, hearing the rest of this, to walk away thinking the sin was failing to recognize greatness. That's not it. The sin was smaller and uglier than that. The sin was deciding a man's word wasn't worth listening to, based on what he looked like doing honest work. I didn't sleep much that night, and the next morning I did the only thing I knew how to do with a feeling that big and that ugly, which was go find the man and say something to him directly, badly, in my own clumsy words, because I've never in my life been somebody who could sit still with a thing like that, unaddressed. He was back finishing the press rebuild that Friday, third and final day of it, and I found him with his head under the frame, checking alignment on the new bushings, and I stood there a minute before I said anything. Because now that I was there, I didn't have the first idea what to say that wouldn't sound like exactly what it was, which was a woman trying to buy back something with words that words probably weren't going to cover. "Mr. Briggs," I said. And he slid out from under the press and sat back on his heels. Same posture as the break room, I noticed, and I don't think that was lost on either of us, and he looked up at me and waited, didn't say anything, just waited, and made me be the one to fill the silence, which I understood even then was its own kind of fairness he was extending me, letting me do the work of it instead of doing it for me. "I owe you an apology," I said. "For March." What I said. "I want you to know I heard, since then, from my own foreman and from my own father, exactly who you are and what you did for this shop. And none of that is why I'm apologizing. I'm not apologizing because it turns out you're somebody. I'd owe you the same apology if you weren't. I laughed at you on your knees in my break room because of what you looked like doing an honest day's work, and that was wrong of me the moment I did it, not the moment I found out the rest." He was quiet a long time. Long enough that I started to wonder if he was going to say anything at all, and I made myself stand there and not feel that silence either. Because I figured I'd done enough talking for one lifetime that particular week. "I appreciate you saying that," he said, finally, and his voice was even, careful. Not warm and not cold either, just measured. The voice of a man deciding how much of himself to extend and how much to hold back. "I've had a lot of practice not needing white folks to see me clear, Miss Holleran. Learned that a long time before you were laughing at anybody. I built a life whether you saw it or not. Raised a daughter who runs a good school, kept a marriage 41 years till my wife passed. Co-signed your daddy's whole future on money I could barely spare, and watched him build something real off the back of it, and I don't regret that, not for one day, whatever came after. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you your apology fixes something that was broke, because it wasn't ever about being fixed. I was whole before you laughed at me, and I'm whole now. What I will say is I appreciate you not making me wait for it, and I appreciate you not doing it because I turned out to be somebody worth apologizing to. That's the part that matters. If you'd apologized because Dale told you I used to be important, that wouldn't have meant a thing to me. Sounds like you understand that's not what you're doing. So, all right. Third time he'd said those two words to me. First time they'd sounded like anything close to an opening. I'd like to make it right, I said. Not just the words. I don't know exactly what that looks like yet, but I'd like your help figuring it out, if you'd let me. We'll see, he said, which wasn't a yes, and I understood that it wasn't going to be a yes. Not that day. Maybe not for a long while, and that I didn't have any right to expect otherwise. Press needs another hour before it'll hold tolerance the way you want it to, he said, and slid back under the frame, and that was the end of the conversation. At least for that day. I want to tell you what I did next, because an apology by itself has never been worth much in my family, and I don't think it should be worth much in anybody's. My father used to say a sorry, with nothing behind it, is just a noise you make so you can stop feeling bad quicker. And I've believed that my whole life. And I wasn't about to let myself off that easy, just because I'd finally said the right words out loud in front of the man they were owed to. First thing I did was go to Briggs Facilities Maintenance directly, not to Walter, to the company, and I asked them what it would cost me to buy his contract out, meaning pay them whatever penalty existed for early termination on their end, and offer Walter a real position on my floor, on my books, at wages that matched what a man with his history and his knowledge was actually worth. Not what a cleaning contract paid him to push a mop through my building twice a week. It cost me $1,800 to the facilities company for breaking the service agreement early, and it cost me a good deal more than that in a starting salary I set for a maintenance and equipment specialist position I built specifically around what I'd watched him do to that Bliss press over 3 days. Full benefits, same package Dale and my other senior guys had. Backdated seniority credit for his original 22 years on my father's payroll, which my accountant told me flat out I didn't have to do, and which I did anyway, because I'd decided somewhere in that week that I wasn't interested in doing the minimum version of this. I offered it to him plain, no ceremony, sitting across from him in my own office with the door shut, and I laid out the terms on paper so he could see I wasn't just talking. He looked at it a long time. Longer than he needed to, I think, to actually read it. I think he was deciding something else in that silence. Something that had less to do with the dollar figure, and more to do with whether he trusted the woman offering it. I'm 68 years old, he said, finally, not looking to run 3 shifts again. Got grandkids I actually want to see grow up, which I didn't get near enough of with my own daughter, working the hours I worked back then. He set the paper down. But I'll take it part-time. 20 hours. Consulting on the equipment, training your young man there, a nod toward the floor, toward Colin, on how to actually listen to a machine instead of just running it till it breaks. That's a job I'd take pride in. Full-time's not something I want anymore, and I'd thank you not to sweeten the number to try and talk me into more hours than I'm offering you. This isn't a negotiation I need to win big. It's a job I might actually enjoy doing. I didn't sweeten it. I took the 20 hours he offered and built the position exactly around what he wanted it to be. And I want to be honest that some small, stupid part of me was almost disappointed. Because some leftover instinct in me had wanted the grand gesture. The full restoration. The thing that would let me feel like I'd fixed it completely in one clean motion. Walter wasn't interested in giving me that feeling, and it took me a while to understand that wasn't him being difficult. It was him telling me plainly what his own life actually needed, and having the standing, finally, after everything, to say so, and be heard. The second thing I did cost me more. In a different currency. I called a meeting on the floor, all 41 of them, end of shift on a Friday, which nobody loves being asked to stay late for. and I stood up in front of my own crew and told them, in about as many words as I've used telling you, exactly what I'd done in that break room in March and exactly why it had been wrong. And I introduced Walter Briggs to the floor as the new equipment specialist, and I told them his history with the shop, the real history, the one my father had finally given me whole, out loud, in front of everybody, including the part where I'd laughed at him for claiming it. I watched Dale's face while I said it, and Jorge's, and I watched Colin's most of all, because that was the room where it cost me the most to say it plain, standing in front of my own son and admitting, in front of the men he worked beside every day, exactly what his mother had done and exactly how wrong it had been. Colin didn't say anything to me about it that night. He came by the house 2 days later, though, and said, "Good that you said it out loud, Ma. Would have been easier not to." And that was the whole conversation, and it was enough. Walter didn't say anything during that meeting. He stood off to the side while I talked, arms crossed, face giving away about as much as it ever gave away, and when I was done, and the floor started clapping, which I hadn't asked for and hadn't expected, and which I think embarrassed him more than it pleased him, he gave a short nod to the room and went back to the toolbox he'd been organizing before I called everybody together, like the whole thing was already finished business as far as he was concerned. Which I understood, by then, was exactly the kind of man he was. The third thing took longer than the first two, because it wasn't a single action. It was a stretch of months. Ordinary Tuesdays and Thursdays, Walter coming in his 20 hours, training Colin on how to read a machine's sound the way Dale said he used to be able to. The two of them getting quiet and easy with each other over the winter the way men do who spend real hours side by side doing real work. I watched that from a distance mostly, on purpose, because I understood by then that my presence in it wasn't the point, the repair between Walter and my son, and Walter and my floor, wasn't something that needed me standing in the middle of it directing traffic. My job was to have built the space for it, and then get out of the way. Trust with Walter himself came slower than any of that, and I want to be honest that it never became the kind of warm, easy thing you might want it to become in a story like this. We were cordial. We were, over time, something close to respectful colleagues. Two people who'd been through something hard together and come out the other side of it with a working peace between them. He never once thanked me for finally treating him decently, and I never once expected him to, because I understood, clearer every month that passed, that decency isn't a gift a person owes gratitude for receiving. It's just the baseline, the floor everybody's owed to start with, and all I'd done was finally lower myself down to that floor. After spending a year standing somewhere above it, I had no right to be standing. There was one afternoon, late that following spring, about 14 months after the break room, when I came by the shop floor and found Walter and my father sitting together out by the loading dock on 2 folding chairs somebody had dragged out into the sun, not saying much, just sitting. The way 2 old men, who've known each other 50 years and settled most of what needed settling, can sit together without needing to fill the air. I stood in the doorway and watched them for a minute before either one noticed me, and I didn't go out and join them. Some things, I've learned, aren't yours to join. Some things you just get to witness from a doorway and be glad, quietly, that they're happening at all. I don't have a clean bow to put on this. I don't think Walter Briggs would want one, and I don't think I've earned the right to hand myself one either. What I've got is smaller than that, and truer, I think, for being small. I laughed at a man on his knees in my break room because of what he looked like doing honest work, and I was wrong the second the sound left my mouth, not the day I found out who he really was. That's the part I have to live with, and the part I hope sticks with anybody hearing this. Don't wait to find out somebody's exceptional before you decide they deserved better from you. They deserved it already, standing right there in front of you, mop bucket and all. If this one hit you the way it hit me telling it, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, hard-earned stories.